Hello, everybody. So I'm Tim. I'm a producer and software engineer at PhotonEngine, and we make networking libraries to enable people like yourselves to make multiplayer games. Today, I'll be presenting to you the 101 in multiplayer game development, and specifically the questions that you need to ask yourselves before you decide to go into multiplayer game development, because especially for indies, it does take resources, and you need to be aware of where those need to be allocated for you to decide whether it's worth to you. So, quick a little bit about Photon itself. We connect at any given point in time about 1.5 million players. That's more or less 5% of Steam. We have close to 600,000 studios actively using us and developers, and over 600 million monthly active users in terms of players. Traffic also, well, a lot, 6 petabytes to be exact. We have been around for 17 years, and that shows as well in the trust that, well, studios, both AAA and smaller, have put in us. And we hope that you can leverage that same framework and infrastructure to make the most creative games possible. So, first of all, the question that you need to ask yourselves, especially as indies, is what are games, but what are games to you, specifically? Of course, we know for players, it's just basic entertainment. That's also what it is for us in our spare time. However, there's a big question as to what games are for you as an independent developer. Are games a mean to express yourself creatively and you are in it for the art? Or are you making a living with games? In which case, it is to be considered a business. And as a business, you kind of have to consider, okay, what is the right strategy? And for that, we best look at what multiplayer games are today in today's market. So if we take a look at simply the games that at this current date are making both the most money and have the most active users, you will notice that 98% of them have a real-time multiplayer component, whether it is on console, PC, or even mobile. Now, there's a little bit of a difference in terms of mobile, where you have to consider whether this is an actual real-time multiplayer game or what EA Games has dubbed social games, which is asynchronous and basically just your old style Ghost Racers, as you had also in the early 90s and early 2000s. Mirror's Edge Catalyst, for instance, is one of these games that, although it had a multiplayer component, was very clear that it was not real-time multiplayer. This is an option for you as well, but it does impact both the game loop and what players want from your game. For the French of you, you will be able to read the slide. For the others, I will quickly translate. And this is the research that took place this year regarding who actually plays multiplayer games, and more importantly, why they do. So there is over 37%, almost a third, well, more than a third of the people playing that want to play online with others. And it is that very sentiment with others that is key in the motivation, both for young and old, as to why multiplayer is important. We are, as humans, social beings. We want to be together. GameWave is a great example. We wanted to be physically together. Board games as well. And in an increasingly digital society, we also want our digital experiences to be shareable with others. In other words, real-time and multiplayer. So, for indies, there is one big and important question. Why should I make multiplayer in the first place? Most indie games are still premium games, which means you get, hopefully, your funding, you build for 2, 3, 4 years, and then hope to God that you will make enough money to sustain yourself until your next release. While this is definitely a model that has existed in our industry for a significant amount of time, it does bring one major concern. And that is a concern that every business faces, indie or AAA, and that is cash flow. How can you keep yourself alive until your release? How can you run your business if you do not have any income? How can you finance your everyday operation, whether it is paying your artist, yourself, or any contractors that you might have, providing assets, sound, and other skills to your project? And that is by going into a more iterative life cycle in terms of development. As you will notice here, we do have a major difference if you go into that direction. And that is, the first part is the time to market. Instead of having to wait for 2 or 3 years until you have a completely 100% finished product to bring to your players and then hope that you marketed it to the right people, you can, in a much shorter time, try to get your core loop up and running, test it, and then in your community do a soft launch, which is where the red arrow is. Starting from this very moment, from this release period, you will be able, to one extent or another, generate revenue. This is important for you because it will help with your cash flow problem. And also, most importantly, it will help your game, because with an earlier soft launch, you will be able to know, are you talking to the right user base? Are you talking to the people that you intended to talk to? And also, what are the things in your game that you might have to adjust in order to actually keep the traction that you're looking for to keep this a viable business? With the operation that already starts at this point, it means you do not have to do one single push for your marketing, for your user acquisition, and you have the time to strategize over a longer period of time how and with whom you want to grow. This will allow you to grow more organically on one end, spend less money on the long term, and again, for yourself, stabilize the actual business that you look at. Now, if we speak of multiplayer game development for the last 3 decades, these are just some of the aspects that you needed to deal with. You had, of course, well, hosting the service. This infrastructure is costly to set up and to run. You needed to have at least one person on your team that knew how to program netcode. You had to decide, okay, are we going to do that on one single platform or multiple platforms, which will then exponentially increase the difficulty? How are you going to matchmake the players? What about the load balancing to make sure that every player has a good connection to a certain instance of the game close to where they are? What do you do with people behind routers and other security measures? How do you connect to them directly, or otherwise known as NAT punch-through? Well, this used to be very difficult, but fortunately over the last decade, every commercial networking library on the market has solved these problems for you. It has become accessible to anybody who wants to do it. If we just take a look at, for instance, what we have, there's just 2 big technologies that you have to concern yourself with when doing multiplayer. That is state transfer, that has been around just like determinism, the technology, for the better part of 3 decades, but it has been tremendously simplified. Which one specifically fits you is not so much a question of what technology is best. This is a common misconception that there is one best case scenario for your multiplayer game. There is not. The right solution depends very much on your game. What is it that you want to build? What are the challenges representative of your gameplay design? What are the user bases that you connect to and the platform limitations? If you want to build for mobile, or if you want to build for a home connection, it will be different limitations, for instance, in bandwidth. It will also be different into what kind of games you can run. Are you going to be running an RTS, for instance, like Age of Empires 2, which requires hundreds upon hundreds units of synchronization, which is simply too much data to be compressed, and in which case you would want a technology, for instance, that synchronizes player input, otherwise known as determinism. If you go with different types of state transfer solution, you do have, of course, different ways of doing it. Are you building a casual game or a virtual conference? Then you don't have to consider anything revolving around cheating, for instance. You can go for lower-powered devices where every client, every player decides, yes, that is the action that actually took place, and I have the authority to tell everybody else in the game that this action actually landed, whether it is hitting an enemy or spawning something into the world. On the other hand, if you go into competitive games such as your Counter-Strikes, your Fortnites, etc., the question becomes, again, how fair do you want to do it, and what is your metric for it to be fair? The most common solution for this is, of course, simply hosting a dedicated server somewhere so that everybody has the same latency to the game. This solution is, although very common, not very scalable for indies because running a server is expensive. And this is where the most common solution for indies comes into play, which is the so-called client host. Client host is an evolution of what used to be known as peer-to-peer. However, the difference here is that instead of every player communicating with all the other players, something that consumes a tremendous amount of bandwidth and is very error-prone, you simply have one single player that also, on top of having their own client simulation, hosts a server simulation. Also, obviously, the gameplay, for instance, if we take an FPS game, does come in various flavors. Therefore, even if you take a look here at the shooting genres, there is not necessarily one best solution, because this will always depend, again, not on what the game is, but what your gameplay is. For a game like Counter-Strike, for instance, state transfer works perfectly fine. You can have that on a client. However, if you were scaling up to something like a Battle Royale game, like you see in Warzone or your Fortnites, then the resources available on a single machine of a player might not actually be enough, especially because our commercial solutions for bandwidth in houses, not your business connections, tend to focus on bandwidth that comes down, so for downloading, not for uploading data, which is the key factor for a good server game. And therefore, in these massive games where you have so much data, so many players that need to be synchronized, you will want to have a dedicated infrastructure regardless. However, if you were going then to something that has a lot of players but is much more casual, if you take, for instance, Minecraft or your Valheim, you can rely on each device to actually have the authority to tell others what has happened, because you do not have to worry about the competitive aspect. Oh, was there a cheat? Was that read at this millisecond at this place in the world? And in which case, you can make use of the shared mode where every client shares the authority over the whole game. Now, enough about the technology itself, but we will go to the final and probably the very most important question to you today. And that is, should you do a single player game or a multiplayer game? Well, in truth, the answer is not either, but rather both. And that might sound somewhat counterintuitive. I just mentioned at the very beginning of this talk that you have limited resources. You might think, okay, we can't do both, because if you look even at the most recent Call of Duties, for instance, which are studios with tremendous amount of money, even they do split the single and multiplayer between multiple studios. One studio will do only the single player campaign, and the other one might do only the multiplayer, and a third one might even just design the maps. Well, you're in luck, because over the last 5 years, networking libraries have evolved to the point where you actually can run both games loops with the same code base. This might seem counterintuitive, because some of you might have heard that you cannot add multiplayer to a single game. This is true. And this is true because single player is a lot more forgiving in your code architecture than multiplayer games are. However, if you do follow the best practices to actually build a multiplayer game, then the same core loop, meaning the same mechanics, the same dynamics of your game, will run whether or not you are in a multiplayer environment. This means for you that you can develop your mechanics in a multiplayer environment, for instance, and then release that as a soft launch while you keep the single player offline, develop it, and you know that the player experience, whether they play with your mechanics in multiplayer mode or in single player mode, which is the major concern if you have both, then they will still have the same experience. Therefore, it's not a question of whether it is one or the other. The answer, it is both. However, keep in mind, not every game needs a multiplayer. So think about whether your idea, your game design, and your interactions are improved by it. And finally, even if you decide to do multiplayer, we have the preconception that multiplayer necessarily means competitive. This is not true, obviously. Also, multiplayer does not necessarily mean player versus player. That is a very important concept, in particular for all of those indie games that do love to emphasize the non-violent and cooperative nature of your games. If you build with multiplayer in mind, you essentially get the ability at release to say, okay, here is my game, but guess what? You can play it with your friends in cooperative mode, or PvE if you want, without having to think, okay, how will I add this down the road, which is a whole different issue. So, in conclusion, going multiplayer allows you to do two things. One, obviously, stabilize your development. As a business, as a person, you still have bills to pay. So even if we are all here because we like being creative, making games is fun, we unfortunately still have to take into consideration how do we manage it and how do we manage to get it out the door without going under. Second of all, and that is just as important as income because it generates the income, is your user base. Having multiplayer allows us to both create players that are more sticky to your game and increase the revenue over time organically without you having to worry, okay, do I have $200,000 to make a marketing push on launch day? Thank you very much for your time, and I'm available for questions if you have any.
Any questions?
Yeah, hi. So let's say I'm interested in making a multiplayer game, but on the competitive side. So you mentioned, you offer a great service where it's very easy to integrate. So I integrate the multiplayer, but I feel like there's the other kind of forms that you kind of touched on, which is the cheating aspect. So do you know of any service, or do you offer any service that makes it more easy to integrate? Because I know there's Punkbuster, there's VAC by Valve, but both of those have a barrier of entry to them. So is there like any service for that or something like that?
So we do not offer any anti-cheat out of the box, for the simple reason that what is considered cheating and how you want to tackle it is very game specific. The two things that you can do in order to prevent cheating is, first of all, of course, integrate an authentication method. So that can be as simple as, for instance, integrating Steam into your app idea to say, okay, we want every player to be able to authenticate themselves via Steam. That will already cut down strongly on people wanting to cheat. The second is, and that is again iterative, thanks to the way that our toolkits are built, you can work on a server plugin. If you really get to the point where cheating is prevalent, it usually comes with success, which I wish you all. Which means also that the plugin can be built on top for the server that we host you, where the clients are connected to, without having to change your actual game code base. There's only so much you can do in the clients. Whether or not you can do it there depends on who has the authority to say, well, I make the final decision that, for instance, that hit landed or not. If you go with servers, then you're usually pretty stable, even in client host. As soon as you go into a shared environment, then of course it's very much a lot tricky. I think an important question, if you go into competitive mode, that you have to take into consideration is, more than cheating at the very beginning, what is the impact of latency on the perceived fairness of your game? Because the first step is always going client host, because that is the most affordable option since you don't have to host an infrastructure. However, it also means that whoever is the host has an almost immediate feedback on whatever they do. So it's not that they're cheating, but they might have a much quicker response than somebody that has 15, 100 milliseconds of delay. And in this case, it becomes less of a technical issue as much as it becomes a game design question as to how do you develop it so that so that the sense of fairness remains among players. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? So I actually had a question. In host-based multiplayer, how do you choose the host?
That is usually the first player connecting to the room that will be hosting the game. So unless you create a more specific matchmaking algorithm to check the ping, etc., which most people don't because it's irrelevant, then it will simply be whoever connects to the server first for this match will be the host. Then, of course, what you do have is what happens if the player disconnects that was the host. Fortunately, nowadays, host migration is included in, for instance, state transfer solutions like Fusion or Indeterminism. You don't care because everybody has already the full game state at any given point, so people can disconnect without issues. But the question of host is really more secondary at this point in time.
So, and when the host disconnects in the middle of a match, who becomes the host? Who is the most likely to become the host?
So that is handled in our technology internally, so I'm not sure I can answer that in detail. I'm sorry.
Okay. Anyone else with questions?
Hi. In games where there's both multiplayer and single player, are the single player like player hosting himself as single one client?
Yes, correct. So the way to look at it is that a single player is a multiplayer game of one player. So in short, it is very much run from the technical side as if it were a multiplayer game, but instead of having multiple people connect to you from outside, you're cut off from the internet and just simulate it for one client.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else with questions? So another, perhaps a bit provocative question is, have you ever had a moment when you're learning about the game and the developers are saying, we want to integrate multiplayer into it, and you're learning about the game and you're learning about the theme and you're thinking, oh God, these people should not have multiplayer shoveled in?
Well, so there's actually two questions in here. The first one is, oh, I want to add multiplayer. And you'd be surprised how often we get that question. You do not add multiplayer to an existing single-player game. If you do this, you basically develop either a second game or you port your whole code base to the new multiplayer technology to be able to enable both. It is completely possible. However, this is more of a process considering porting than it is just adding it on top of an existing thing. The second question is it worth adding multiplayer? This is a very subjective point in the sense that if you envision your game design to be better with more than one player, then the answer is yes. It's not really up to us to decide because it's about your player experience. So I don't think that there is a technically right or wrong answer in that regard, but rather if as a developer you think that your gameplay loop and your game design are improved by having more than one player in a session, then the answer is yes. If you don't believe so, then the answer is a clear no.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? If not, then thank you so much for attending.
Thank you very much.